Well, the Young Men and Young Women's Christian movement is actually one of the real points of my involvement with the Y. I was a child, I did not grow up in the Y movement. I didn't have that opportunity. And so one of the interesting benefits that I had during my time in board membership and board leadership was to actually learn more about the core values of the YM and YW movements, because it really is a remarkable history. It's a remarkable history both globally as well as in America. And the core values are just exceedingly, I think the people who commit themselves to their professional life in the Y communities are really deeply ingrained with those core values. And I think it's embodied with some of the previous mottos that we've had, but I think it goes strong families, strong children, strong community. And the Y movement nationally, I think, is just an excellent umbrella that provides so much kind of training and development support, so many program resources that come to the Y movement, so much in incorporation of kind of those values that you oftentimes get this great cohort of managerial and leadership development that comes from the staff, because people who participate and are trained in those core values really feel committed to them. And I think Evanston has always had a great experience with basically being able to recruit executive directors who have either grown up in the Y movement, like our current director, Bill Geiger, who was himself a participant as a young person in Evanston, or someone like our prior director, who I worked with mostly, Tony Lee, who was an example of a young man from China who comes to America and goes to Springfield College, which is the YMCA college in Springfield, Massachusetts, and decides to stay involved in the Y movement. And his whole career was built upon those values. And so I think a real hallmark is that the organization, the Y umbrella, is really a global organization that tries to bring these same principles of engagement to communities, and it has really just been tremendously successful. I think one of the interesting challenges has been at various points in time, depending on that I observed even in Evanston, is the question about the use of the term Christian because Evanston is a very diverse community in terms of its religious activities and religious faiths that are represented. And I think one of the interesting board challenges at a couple moments in time when you have to kind of link in was kind of the interpretation of the use of the word even Christian in the Y movement. And I think that it's been possible to kind of work through those issues, because on the ground, when we actually are developing and delivering these programs, I think a real element of that part of the Christian element and Christian faith is to in fact be inclusive of all faiths, and I think Evanston really brings that out. But I think it's also been, not to kind of sugarcoat the history, but I think there's also been moments where that's been a concern to some folks about, well, is it going to be an environment where that becomes more of the emphasis than on the building up of broader community and inclusion. And I think in the Evanston environment and in the Evanston community, the emphasis on diversity, the emphasis on inclusion, part of this other history that we've had with the Emerson Street Y, I think has tried to build all of that on kind of a community basis and to really build out the strength of the whole framework of the Y movement. But it was a significant part of my education in terms of, because again, I did not grow up myself in the Y movement. And I think it's always been interesting to me to ask the question, like we've started in this discussion, about, well, how did you get introduced to the Y? And many people come to the Y from many different paths, but I think they all find kind of a place in the Y mission, which is strongly based on inclusion. The McGaw YMCA being here and present and engaged in the community for 125 years, I would suspect that in all of Evanston that there's probably only, you could count on maybe two hands the number of organizations and institutions that have kind of persisted that long. I'm sure Northwestern University, I am sure some churches that we have had that length of a history. And I think to have survived as basically a community organization with the number of programs and through the number of changes that have happened over time is really an unusual testament. I think it would be interesting to know how many I don't really know how many YMCAs there are that have had that length of time. I think it's also, though, I think it is a reflection of the strength of having an environment that, again, continues to be open to people of all walks of life, to people who have all kinds of, who come to the Y seeking all different kinds of services and support and opportunities. And I think it's been the consistency that we've had of being in one location, of being kind of dependent, and I think, in fact, dedicated board and volunteer management that's been able to kind of find professional leadership that fulfills those values. And I think the essence of the volunteer board has been that people have been so committed to those missions that's what sustained it for this long of time, even through periods when it's really had some challenges financially. When it's had challenges, I'm sure it must have been in the times of the Depression or in the wars where they didn't have as many resources. But I think its constancy in its location, in its programming, its dependability, its kind of known quantity, has really served it well in this long history, and that is a sign of the strength of board and staff leadership. My dream for the Y is that I would hope that it would have the opportunity in its next 100 years to really fully endow the fee assistance support that it provides to members of the community who can't otherwise afford to be there. I think the need to have kind of permanent fundraising, kind of a store of a successful part of a capital plan that would enable it to really assure in perpetuity that any family or any child who wanted to participate would be able to have that the board would be able to have a dependable source of support for making those services available. And I think that would be I think we do that partially, and we've had great support from supporters and funders and generous donors over the years. But I really think that the ability to kind of sustain that mission of openness and diversity comes from the ability to kind of afford to pay for it. And I think it would be great if in the next 125 years we could accomplish that. I think also it would be a wonderful goal would be to continue to just be able to have the resources to kind of sustain the plant, it's the physical space of the Y, in a way that assures that it's always going to be positively maintained and maintained at a level that the members deserve. And oftentimes it gets hard in times of financial stress. Sometimes you have to kind of stretch resources around how much is available in terms of to do all the things that we want to have done. And so again, just continuing to support kind of the core resources that the Y has at its disposal would be a dream that I would have for the Y. So then you would know that the programs could always be sustained. I think the physical location of the Y, particularly in the part of the historic part of it that sits along Grove Street, is a reflection of kind of the strength and the foundation that during all these 100+ years that people have been committed to kind of maintaining that classic facility. And in fact, it does reflect that by having still a commitment to a residence facility, as well as to being able to support access to the programs to the maximum amount of time, it is a facility that does not rest very often during the day. One of the neat accomplishments that we had when we worked on the renovation of the residence facility in the early 90s is that we did get support through some of our local congressional representatives to help us get additional grants to be able to preserve the window casement treatments, which are in fact part of the historic character of the building. And yet we were concerned about energy efficiency and kind of warmth, and they were old casement windows that really had never been replaced probably in about 50, 60 years. But through this additional grant making, we were able to kind of get windows that retained that style and yet were more energy efficient and were easier to maintain and able to provide a better living environment for the residents. So I think there's been efforts all along the way to kind of make sure that the architectural style of the current, particularly on the Grove Street side, kind of stays consistent with the architecture. And it has presented challenges at times, because the use of the facility as it's grown, one of the real challenges that we have is how do you kind of move so many people from one side of the program areas to the other side of the new facility. But I think on balance we did well for the resources that we had to try and find ways to kind of make those linkages. It certainly isn't perfect, but I think we've been able to kind of create a distinctive presence on both sides. And I think that the facility is accessed to its maximum extent by families and by swimmers at 5:30 in the morning, I'm sure, all the way to youth who like to hang out until they're probably kind of booted out the door by the folks saying it's time to get home by 11 or 12 o'clock. I mean, I think, again, my experience and my engagement's been a little bit different than other folks. And so it was a great opportunity. It offered a great opportunity for me to exercise some leadership skills. I have met a tremendous number and have made a tremendous number of friends in my professional and personal life as a result of the engagement with the Y. I continue to value kind of being connected to the Y, even though I'm not right this instant, kind of being as personally active in some committee work as I've once been. But I believe that that's an experience that many people have had, that through these opportunities to serve, you build these connections, and they end up serving you in great ways as you kind of move forward in other aspects of your life.